The men had set to work without incident. The sound of axes had rung out through the trees as it should. But after an hour, Torsten had stopped mid-swing and stood motionless, listening. When asked what he heard, he said, "Nothing. That's the trouble." The others had noticed it too. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no squirrels, no insects. Even the sound of the river seemed muffled, as though coming from a great distance. One man said it felt as though the air itself had thickened, pressing against his ears. Then, from somewhere deeper in the trees, there had been a sound. It was not loud. Several men described it as a low hum, almost below the range of hearing, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard. Others said it was closer to a voice, but not one speaking words. It rose and fell in a rhythm that seemed deliberate, though none of them could say what it resembled. They had stood listening for perhaps a minute. Then Torsten had set down his axe, turned, and walked back toward camp without a word. The others had followed. Harrow, upon hearing this, went to the site himself that afternoon, accompanied only by Gage. They walked the 3 miles upriver in silence. The day was overcast, the sky low and gray, and the forest seemed darker than Harrow remembered. The trail followed the river closely, and the sound of the water was steady, and there's a line in Thomas Harrow's logging ledger, dated November 14th, 1888, that reads simply, "Crew refused bend past Widow's Elbow. Lost full day's work. Did not argue with them." Beneath it, in different ink, as if added later by an unsteady hand, "I understand now why they would not go." Harrow was not a superstitious man. His record spanned 7 years of timber operations along the Stillwater River in what was in the Washington Territory, and they are meticulous, dispassionate, concerned only with bored feet and weather delays. He documented broken axles, late supply runs, and the dismissal of drunken workers with the same flat precision. But after November of 1888, his entries grow sparse. By January, they stop entirely. The camp was abandoned by March. The equipment left where it stood, and Thomas Harrow himself returned to Ohio, where he lived quietly until his death in 1903. He never logged again. No one from that crew ever explained, in writing or spoken testimony, what happened along that stretch of river. But in the years that followed, other camps established upstream and downstream worked their way steadily through the forest, except for one particular bend. Foremen would consult hand-drawn maps passed from crew to crew, and the route would simply curve around it, bypassing nearly a mile of valuable old-growth timber. When asked why, they would say the ground was bad, or the trees too remote, or that the riverbank was unstable. But the ground was firm, and the trees were some of the finest in the territory. They just would not go there. The Stillwater River ran cold and fast to the heart of the Cascade foothills, a dark vein of snowmelt cutting between stands of Douglas fir and western red cedar that had stood for centuries. In 1888, this was country only recently open to serious commercial logging. The Northern Pacific Railway had pushed to the mountains just 5 years prior, and with it came the boom, mills, camps, and crews of men willing to spend months in the wilderness for steady pay and a chance at something better. Thomas Harrow's operation was one of dozens. He employed between 20 and 30 men depending on the season, fellers, buckers, river drivers, and camp support. They lived in rough-hewn bunkhouses near the riverbank, rose before dawn, and worked until the light failed. It was brutal, grinding labor, and the men who did it were not easily unsettled. The camp was located roughly 18 miles upriver from the nearest settlement, a supply station called Forks Landing that consisted of a trading post, a ferry dock, and little else. Supplies came every 2 weeks by mule train, weather permitting. In winter, the camp was entirely cut off. The stretch of river the men called Widow's Elbow lay another 3 miles upstream from Harrow's main camp. It earned its name not from any known tragedy, but from the shape of the bend itself, a sharp, unnatural curve where the river seemed to fold back on itself, creating a narrow channel flanked by steep, moss-covered banks. The forest grew dense there, old and untouched. The canopy was so thick that even in summer, The ground remained in near perpetual twilight. It was prime timber. Everyone knew it. Harrow had planned to begin cutting there in late October, once the easier tracks closer to camp had been cleared. He walked the site himself in early autumn with his foreman, a man named Gage, and found no issue. The trees were sound, the ground accessible, and the river was deep enough to float logs downstream during the spring drive. They marked the first trees to fall and returned to camp to prepare the crew. But when the day came to begin work, the men would not go. It began with small refusals. On October 29th, Harrow sent a crew of 8 men upriver to begin clearing underbrush and laying cordage road for the timber sleds. They left after breakfast with axes, saws, and a week's worth of supplies. By mid-afternoon, they had returned. The foreman, Gage, reported that the men had worked for perhaps 2 hours before growing uneasy. When pressed, he could not specify what had unsettled them. No one had been injured. No animal had been spotted. The weather was clear and cold, the ground firm. One of the men, a Norwegian named Torsten, said only that the place felt like a church after a funeral. Another, a young feller called Dunn, refused to say anything at all and requested a transfer downstream. Harrow was irritated but not alarmed. He believed, as many men of his generation did, that superstition was the domain of the weak-minded. He offered a modest bonus to any crew willing to return the next day. 6 men volunteered. They came back before noon. This time, Gage's report was more specific. When they reached Widow's Elbow, Harrow stopped to survey the work. The men had cleared perhaps 20 yards of underbrush. Their tools lay where they'd been dropped, axes embedded in stumps, a saw resting across a log. A tin cup sat upright on a flat rock, still half filled with coffee. Cold, Harrow stood in the center of the clearing and listened. The silence was absolute. He waited for several minutes, turning slowly, scanning the trees. There were no animals, no movement, no wind. The river, though visible through the trees, seemed oddly distant, its sound faint and directionless. Gage, beside him, shifted his weight and said quietly, "Do you feel it?" Harrow did not answer immediately. He did feel something, a pressure, perhaps, or a weight in the air. It was not unpleasant, but it was present, undeniable. It reminded him, absurdly, of sensation one feels before a thunderstorm, when the atmosphere seems to gather itself in anticipation. But there was no storm. The sky was still and heavy. "There's nothing here," Harrow said finally, though his voice sounded strange to his own ears. Too loud, too flat. They stayed another 10 minutes. Harrow walked the perimeter of the site, examined the trees, checked the riverbank. Everything was as it should be, except that he could not shake the feeling that they were being observed. Not by an animal, not by another person, but by something patient and immense, something that had noticed their presence and was waiting to see what they would do. When they returned to camp that evening, Harrow said nothing to the men. He made no mention of unease or silence. He simply noted in his ledger that the site had been inspected and found adequate, but he did not send the crew back. For 2 weeks, Harrow attempted to organize work at Widow's Elbow, and for 2 weeks, the men found reasons to delay. They were not openly defiant. They did not refuse orders or threaten to leave. They simply moved slowly, found complications, reported equipment failures that could not be quickly verified. A sled axle cracked. A saw needed sharpening. The weather turned briefly and made the trail impassable. Harrow knew he was being managed. These were experienced men, and they were coordinating their resistance with the practiced subtlety of workers who understood the limits of their foreman's patience. On November 10th, he called a camp meeting. He did not raise his voice or make threats. He simply explained that the timber at Widow's Elbow represented a significant portion of the season's projected yield, and that without it, the camp would not meet its obligations. There would be no bonuses. There might not be spring contracts. He asked if anyone wished to speak. A long silence followed. Then Torsten, the Norwegian, stood. "We'll go," he said quietly, "if you go with us." Harrow agreed. On the morning of November 12th, Harrow led a crew of 12 men upriver. They brought full equipment, enough supplies for 3 days, and 2 mules to haul timber. The weather was cold and clear, the river running fast with early winter melt. They reached Widow's Elbow by mid-morning and set immediately to work. For the first hour, everything proceeded normally. The men fell into the familiar rhythm of the work, axes biting into wood, the slow creak and crash of falling trees, the rasp of saws through fresh-cut timber. Harrow moved among them, checking cuts, marking trees, keeping the work steady. But as the morning wore on, the silence returned. It came gradually like a tide. First the birds stopped singing, then the insects ceased their drone. Finally, even the sound of the river seemed to retreat, until the only noise was the work itself, the axes, the saws, the breathing of men. Torsten was the first to stop. He straightened, wiped his brow, and turned slowly, scanning the trees. "It's here," he said. The other men paused. Harrow, standing near the riverbank, felt his chest tighten. "What's here?" he asked, though his voice sounded distant to his own ears. "I don't know," Torsten said, "but it's watching." They stood in the clearing, 12 men and their foreman, listening. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, the sound began. It was low and resonant, a hum that seemed to come from the earth itself. It did not grow louder, but it spread, filling the air, vibrating in their chests, pressing against their skin. It had no source. It came from everywhere and nowhere. One of the younger men dropped his axe and stepped backward. Another crossed himself and whispered something in a language Harrow did not recognize. Harrow tried to speak, tried to call men back to work, but the sound made it difficult to think. It was not painful, but it was intrusive, overwhelming. It felt ancient and patient, like the voice of something that had been waiting for a very long time. And then, between the trees, something moved. It was not an animal. Harrow saw it first, a shape among the trunks, perhaps 50 yards into the forest. It was tall, far taller than a man, and it moved with a slow, deliberate grace that seemed wrong, as though it were gliding rather than walking. The trees themselves seemed to bend slightly as it passed, their shadows shifting in ways that did not match the light. It did not approach. It simply moved parallel to the clearing, passing from left to right with a terrible, unhurried certainty. Harrow could not make out details. The shape seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, a dark mass that his eyes refused to focus on. He had the impression of great height, of limbs too long and joints that bent in unnatural places. But when he tried to look directly at it, his vision blurred and his head began to ache. Beside him, Gage made a low, strangled sound. "Don't look at it," Torsten said quietly. His voice was steady, but his face was pale. "Don't look directly at it." The other men had seen it too. Some had turned away, staring at the ground or the river. Others stood frozen, transfixed. One man had sunk to his knees, his hands pressed over his ears, though the sound had not grown louder. The shape continued its slow passage through the trees. It did not hurry. It did not pause. It simply moved, as if it had been moving through this forest for longer than anyone could remember, and would continue long after they were gone. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The sound stopped. The silence that followed was so complete that Harrow could hear his own heartbeat loud and frantic in his ears. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Torsten turned, picked up his axe, and began walking back toward camp. The others followed. Harrow did not try to stop them. They returned to camp in silence. No one spoke of what they had seen. When the other workers asked what happened, the crew offered no explanation. They simply gathered their belongings, collected their pay, and within 2 days, half the camp had left. Harrow made no effort to replace them. He continued to operate for another month, working downstream tracks, but his heart was no longer in it. His ledger entries grew shorter, more perfunctory. He wrote nothing of Widow's Elbow, except for that single line in November. "I understand now why they would not go." In the years that followed, other camps moved into the region. The timber industry boomed, and the Stillwater River became one of the most productive logging corridors in the territory. Crews worked their way steadily upstream and down, clearing thousands of acres of old-growth forest. But the bend called Widow's Elbow remained untouched. Maps drawn by foremen and passed between camps showed the river as a smooth, unbroken line through that section, as though the bend did not exist. When new workers asked why such valuable timber had been left standing, the older men would offer practical explanations. Difficult terrain, unstable ground, better opportunities elsewhere. But in the bunkhouses at night, when the lamps burned low and the forest pressed close, a different story circulated. They said the trees that were older than the others, older than the land itself. They said the silence in that place was not absence, but presence, something that had lived there long before men came, and would remain long after they were gone. They said that if you stood very still in that stretch of forest, you could feel it watching, not with eyes, but with an awareness vast and patient, like the attention of something that existed outside of time. And they said that Thomas Harrow, before he left for Ohio, had burned every map and survey document that showed the exact location of Widow's Elbow, as though he hoped that by erasing it from paper, he might erase it from memory. But the forest remembers. The Harrow Timber Company dissolved in the spring of 1889. The equipment was sold at auction, and the land leases were transferred to a larger operation out of Seattle. Records from the Territorial Land Office show that the new company logged extensively along the Stillwater River between 1890 and 1903, harvesting an estimated 12 million board feet of timber. But a survey map from 1891, held in the Washington State Archives, shows a curious notation along one section of the river. The area is marked with a simple red X and the words, "Avoid ground unsuitable." There is no geological report to support this designation. The terrain in that section is nearly identical to the surrounding land, and no evidence of instability or flooding has ever been documented. In 1907, a historian named Millicent Frost conducted interviews with retired loggers for a regional history project. Several men, when asked about their time on the Stillwater, mentioned the bend upstream from Harrow's old camp. They spoke carefully, as though unwilling to say too much. One man, identified only as J.R. former Bucker, told Frost, "We knew not to go past the elbow. It wasn't a rule anybody wrote down. You just knew. Same way you know not to walk too close to a cliff edge in the dark." Another, a river driver named Samuel Pope, said, "There are places in the old woods that aren't meant for people. You can feel it when you're near them. The air changes. Your body knows, even if your mind doesn't want to." When Frost asked what he meant by places not meant for people, Pope declined to elaborate. Thomas Harrow himself left almost nothing behind. After return to Ohio, he worked briefly as a bookkeeper and then retired to a small farm outside Cincinnati. He lived alone, never married, and rarely spoke of his years in the Washington Territory. A distant cousin, interviewed in 1954, recalled that Harrow had been a serious, silent man who disliked forests and refused to go camping or hunting. He said once that he'd seen enough trees to last a lifetime, the cousin remembered. But the way he said it, it sounded like he was talking about something else. Harrow's logging ledgers were donated to the Ohio Historical Society after his death, but several pages are missing. The entries from late October through mid-November 1888 have been carefully removed, not torn, but cut out with a blade, leaving only the binding threads. No explanation was ever provided. The forest around Widow's Elbow remains largely intact. In the decades since, conservation efforts and changing economics have slowed logging in the region, and much of the old-growth timber that once drew men like Harrow has been protected. But even today, hikers and hunters who venture into the area report a peculiar unease. The forest there is quieter than it should be. Trails seem to curve around certain sections without clear reason. Compasses behave erratically, and GPS signals grow weak. In 2003, a forestry survey team attempted to conduct a biodiversity study in the area. The project was abandoned after 3 days. The lead researcher, Dr. Alan Moss, wrote in his notes, "The silence is oppressive. Crew morale deteriorating rapidly. No clear reason, but unanimous decision to relocate." When pressed by the funding agency to provide a more detailed explanation, Dr. Moss submitted a terse addendum. "Some environments are not conducive to human presence. Recommend future surveys be conducted from aerial platforms." The report was filed, and no further ground surveys have been attempted. There's a passage in an old journal, found in a second-hand bookstore in Seattle in 1972, that may or may not belong to Thomas Harrow. The handwriting matches samples from his ledgers, but the journal itself is undated and unsigned. It reads, "I have spent years trying to understand what we encountered in that place. I have read books on geology, biology, and the natural sciences. I have consulted with educated men and sought rational explanations. But I am left with this. There are things in the world that exist outside our systems of understanding. They do not belong to us. They were here before we arrived, and they will be here when we are gone. We call them forests, rivers, mountains, as though naming them makes them ours. But they are not ours. They are themselves, and in certain places at certain times, they remind us of that fact. I do not know what we saw. I do not think it can be known. But I know that it allowed us to leave, and that we should never have been there in the first place. The bend in the Stillwater River is still marked on some maps, though its name has been largely forgotten. Widow's Elbow exists now only in old logging records, faded survey notes, and the quiet warnings passed between those who work in the deep woods. The trees are very old. The silence is complete. And if you stand very still, beneath the canopy where the light does not quite reach, you might feel it, patient, immense, and watching, waiting, perhaps, for the next person who does not understand that some places are not meant to be disturbed. The forest does not explain itself. It does not need to.